The theme of today's lecture is socio-economic formation as an object of governance. If you draw it, it will look something like this. There is nature, society as part of nature. Inside the circle which is designated as society, there is the table that you saw in the presentation about social institutions, family, statehood, science, school. Horizontally, we consider them as sources of goods, and vertically as recipients of goods. This table represents social processes, the duration of which spans the life of several generations. Therefore, in order to understand the table, one needs to think in terms of processes, how a family lives over the course of several generations, how statehood lives over the course of several generations, with what science and school are engaged over the course of several generations, and how they interact with each other while generations change. In addition, we have an organized technological complex from which we get what is called the economic support of our life, families, science, the state, and the system of education. And all this interaction with nature, that is, chains of interaction, they are directed in both directions from every fragment of the system, and they are indicated in the picture as directional arrows towards both sides. This is the first thing. What further? Further, it turns out that if you look at society from the standpoint of the sufficiently general theory of governance, then society is a supersystem. A supersystem is a plurality of elements, every one of which is governed on the basis of information algorithmics available in its memory, and which is capable of giving out information into the environment to other elements, and which is capable of receiving information from the environment and from other elements. In addition to this, every element has some kind of intellect. Intellect, in the most general sense, is a process of information processing as a result of the operation of which new information modules appear, either on the basis of the combinatrix of what was already known, or fundamentally new, of which nothing was previously known. Moreover, the views on intellect are different, because there are people who are of the opinion that intellect is inherent only in man, and there are people who believe that intellect is a pan-social process, even more, a pan-natural process, and all intellects that exist in nature work on the basis of the same objective laws. This point of view was expressed by academician N.M. Amosov. Read his book, Algorithms of Intellect. It is also useful to read V.V. Ivanov, Even Anod, Brain Asymmetry and Science Systems. The logic of the sufficiently general theory of governance assumes that there is always a higher hierarchical governance up to the highest hierarchical governance. Therefore, nothing is accidental, nothing is objectiveless. If a supersystem is introduced into the environment, then it is for the sake of achieving some objectives. If we look at the introduction of a supersystem into the environment, then, in the broadest sense, it turns out that a supersystem and its elements have to have some basic information algorithmic support which ensures the primary stability of the supersystems in the environment. If the basic information algorithmic support is inadequate, then the environment damages the supersystem up to the complete destruction of the supersystem. Therefore, a certain basic level has to ensure the minimum interaction of the supersystem and the environment, and the stability of abidance. But if there is only the minimum, then there is no development. And in order to increase the effectiveness of the interaction of the supersystem with the environment, we need to introduce a supersystem which is more developed, of the next generation. If we refuse such an approach, then we have to provide a certain variable part of the information algorithmic support, which would form in the process of interaction of the supersystem with the environment. If there is intellect, then there is also a source that forms this variable part. Now let's look at ourselves. Every one of us is a carrier of one individual intellect. If we get together, do we generate an intellect of higher order than our individual ones? Depending on the answer to this question, we get this or that view on the world. So, if we proceed from the fact that we unite a plurality of intellects, individual, functionally formed, into a certain system, that is, there is a process of information exchange between them, an integration of their powers, Then we get an intellect of a higher order, which, in terms of power, should exceed the individual one. Next, the question arises about the carriers of this integral collective intellect. The simplest and most obvious is that if we read something among the ancient authors, and his opinion exerts an impact on the decisions we work out, then it should be admitted that the ancient author is also a member of our collective intellect, and the information that he captured in a certain text, some illustrations to this text, this is also information that we process in this collective intellect. In this case, it is captured on material carriers in the form of an ancient manuscript or an ancient illustration. Well, if there are no such material carriers, then we need to transition from the position of the world understanding of the European tradition, where there exists only what we can see and read, and what we cannot touch, see, this supposedly does not exist. Well, if you approach the human organism from the standpoint of physics, then all atoms are surrounded by some kind of fields. Molecules are also surrounded by fields. The structures from which the molecules are made up that form our organism are also surrounded by fields. And there is the macrobiofield of the organism, which, factually, carries the entire human psyche. Because the performance speed of biochemical processes, their information capacity, is definitely insufficient for our psyche to function as it does. That is, there also exists a collective intellect. Its carrier and the carrier of the collective psyche are biofields emitted by our organisms. If this is understood, then we need to look somewhat differently at everything that was offered to us in the old days in social studies courses at school and in sociology and political science courses. One of the themes in the sociology course is man, a biosocial being. It implies that there is a biological basis and there is something social that is connected with this biological basis. If one is asked to explain the theme in detail, then usually a stupor arises and words like, "What is not clear here?" Basically some general words. Moreover, words so general that they do not characterize man as man. Because the textbook of social studies by L.N. Bogolyubov, among the specific characteristic features of man, gives one of the following. Well, one of them is a soft earlobe, but there are people who do not have earlobes from birth. And it turns out that Bogolyubov's textbook, in a hidden form, preaches racism. So if we look at a person, if he has earlobes, and the textbook says that this is a characteristic feature of a person, then this means that this is Homo sapiens. But if he does not have earlobes, this means that this is not Homo sapiens. Further, the question of a purely racist order arises. From racism, many, including global disasters, can be extracted. Therefore, the question on what characterizes man, precisely in the aspects of biology, is really very important. And this is a key question for further building of sociology. What characterizes man and what distinguishes all of us from the rest of that which exists in the biosphere of the planet? It turns out that much of what is usually interpreted as a monopoly of man is present in one form or another in the life of other biological species. The Americans, for example, love to split grants. Duke University split grants to study the lifestyle of orangutans in Africa. It turned out that orangutans carry culture. That is, a certain set of knowledge and skills which is passed outside of biology on the basis of social organization. If one goes on the internet, then people maintain that cats are actually able to predict the situation in some cases quite accurately and show care for their owners. If you see in the metro someone taking a cat in a basket from his dacha or to his dacha, then it's a question of who is taking whom. Because a cat possessing some mystical abilities is able to protect through the subtle world those who carry it in a basket. Some parrot owners report that parrots use articulate speech quite meaningfully, and for them this is a channel of communication with the owners, which they more or less successfully have mastered. Speaking of articulate speech, it turns out that this is not the best means of passing information from one individual to another, because the ambiguity of those images that arise in every one of us behind words is a fact, and the passing of information based on articulate speech is a very slow process. What is more, the unequivocality of the perception of those images that are passed in words is far from always ensured. One such example on this theme is L. Uspensky's book, Word About Words. As a student, at the first lecture he was in an audience. The lecture was given by academician L.V. Scherba, who began by summoning a female student to the blackboard and dictating to her the following phrase: "The Glocke Koestris, Steckli Budeld the Bakker, and is Kurdjacking the Bakkeling." After that, they studied this phrase. The main questions are: why is this phrase not clear? Because there are no images behind the words. Then the question arises: is it possible to pass images directly from a person to a person? Yes, it is. This is called telepathy. But this is a skill that is not in demand in our culture. And many, believing that it does not and cannot exist in principle, reject it when one way or another, by chance, seances of telepathic communication with someone spontaneously appear of their own accord. Therefore, the question of what distinguishes us after studying everything that is in the biosphere does not become easier, although everything is actually quite obvious. We are in the lead in the biosphere in terms of the ratio of the mass of the brain of an adult to the mass of the brain of a newborn baby of the species Homo sapiens. And this is, indeed, the main indicator, the main biological characteristic of a person with which everything is connected in our biology, and much is connected precisely with this in our culture. Imagine a situation. A fawn can run after its mother half an hour after it's born. How big is the fawn's brain? Not big. Imagine a woman giving birth to a baby with a skull volume of, well, at least 0.8 in comparison with the brain of an adult. This is a completely different anatomy. The caliber of the birth canal is off the charts. And then the question arises: could a female of such a biological species move and lead a more or less active lifestyle in nature? The answer to this question is actually simple. Biomechanically, this is impossible. If we draw parallels with other biological species of primates, then a newborn person, in terms of development, corresponds to about 50 to 60% of the gestation period of other monkeys. That is, a human baby is not even a baby from the point of view of a gorilla, it is just a miscarriage. And this is the main biological characteristic with which everything is connected. Moreover, in the humanitarian sciences, one of the problems is the absence of understanding of information as an objective category of being, and the absence of understanding of algorithmics as an objective category of being. Therefore, when comrades in the humanitarian sciences pronounce such words as culture, instincts, that is to say passions, they have no answer to the question on what is behind all that. And if one looks at it from the standpoint of the sufficiently general theory of governance, then culture as well is an information algorithmic system. Instincts and innate reflexes are also an information algorithmic system. The term information algorithmic system implies the presence of objectives for which certain algorithms work. If culture and instincts are information algorithmic systems, then the question on their purpose arises. If you relate to what I started with, then instincts, the whole complex of instinctive programs, are the basic information algorithmic support of any biological species, and culture, whatever it may be, is a variable part of the information algorithmic support of any species which provides its adaptation to the environment. Therewith, the type of its population we consider from the standpoint of the theory of governance as a supersystem. Biologically, all monkeys are divided into two categories: herd pack and familial. Herd pack monkeys are characterized by the fact that they do not have a den. They are always on the run, somewhere, somehow. Herd pack monkeys defecate wherever they run, while those who live in families, they usually have a den, and they never defecate in the den and in the vicinity of the den. This is to the question of why our school desks, elevators are covered with graffiti, the walls and the blocks of our houses are covered with graffiti. Because the biological functions of excrement in the biosphere, this means the occupation of the territory. That which is in the biological programs often has cultural shells and continuations. An inscription like Kitty and Osia were here is a cultural shell and a continuation of these very instinctive programs to mark the territory. Therefore, we cannot say that within 13,000 years since the death of the past civilization that we have advanced far in development. Speaking of biology, there is an organism and there is genetics. Genetics sets instinctive behavioral programs and innate, unconditioned reflexes. Furthermore, it also carries the potential of the development of culture, and it also carries the program of the development of the organism and the development of the psyche. Moreover, the genetic program of the development of the human organism is not an autonomous program. In order for it to work fully, interaction with the external environment is required. And among other things, the genetic programs of the development of the organisms of boys and girls are different, not only in the aspect of anatomy, but also in the aspect of biochemistry and physiology. In particular, a boy needs more movements for development by 5 to 6 times than a girl. If the girl is overloaded with movements, then a hormonal disruption occurs, because the activity that is assigned to her in this case gives a hormonal disruption. The girl cannot maintain a normal hormonal background, and an anatomical shift towards male development occurs. And if boys have a deficiency in movements, a hormonal shift also occurs, which ensures a development close to the female type. There may be factors in the culture that stimulate this, and actually, the propaganda and dissemination of the culture of the unisex style in the West is a factor of biological destruction of the local civilization. That is, sociologists and culturologists should know biology in general and human biology in particular. Otherwise, it is possible to generate huge troubles. Now let's see. If instincts and unconditioned reflexes are an innate component, culture is a variable component. Culture is not innate. This is all information and algorithmics that are passed from generation to generation, in addition to the genetic mechanism of the biological species. And among other things, our psyche also has components that are conditioned by that which in biology is called imprinting. That is, the effect of the first impression. If a duckling hatches from an egg, then the first thing that comes into its field of vision is automatically perceived as mother duck. This is typical of the natural environment. And in a biological laboratory, anything can be mother duck. A laboratory assistant, a cat that passes by, something else. The effect of the first impression does exist. And when we grow and master the culture, we master it on the basis of the mechanism of imprinting, which acts very intensively during the period in which we are growing. And it practically completes its work when the organism is formed. Therefore, in childhood, we learn foreign and native languages easily, without paying any attention to it. Moreover, if the linguistic environment is multilingual, the child is able to master all the languages of this linguistic environment, and is able to not confuse them with each other. That is, Russian by itself, German by itself, so on, depending on how many languages there exist in the child's perception. At an adult age, some of this can be forgotten if not needed. Nonetheless, this fact exists. The imprinting component is very peculiar in the human psyche, because on the one hand, it is not innate, consequently it is variable. And on the other hand, when something is formed in it, it is almost as unchanged as instinctive programs of behavior that are innate. Therefore, there is the saying, learning in childhood and adolescence is like engraving in a stone. Learning at an old age is like writing in the sand. Behind this saying, there is the imprinting component. And it does exist. Here is one of the examples that demonstrates this. An experiment was carried out at VDNKH, a stall with ice cream, in which there were 2 sorts of ice cream. One sort was made according to the Soviet standards, on the basis of natural creams and everything else. The second sort was a product of chemistry in the style of Baskin-Robbins. Citizens were offered to taste both, and to answer which tasted better. Those who had tasted Soviet ice cream beforehand, they immediately recognized the taste of natural creams and everything else, and said that it tasted better. And the children who had tasted Baskin-Robbins plasticine, for them, ice cream is the Baskin-Robbins plasticine, and something else is not ice cream, so it is not tasty. When we do something in the presence of children, the children do not yet have intellect and knowledge to evaluate. Therefore, this immediately falls into the imprinting component of the psyche, and then when the children grow up, adults wonder where that comes from. Now we will again return to biology. We can consider a situation when culture is at a zero level of development or close to zero, when all behavior is instincts, unconditioned reflexes, memory, and an individual's own reasoning in the form in which it has taken shape. So what do we have in this case? What is the first task that has to be solved? Reproduction of the population of the biological species in the continuity of generations. Moreover, this task has to be solved in an automatic mode. Accordingly, if it has to be solved in an automatic mode, where should all the programs which have to ensure the solution of this task be loaded? Into instincts, into unconditioned innate reflexes. If this is admitted, then much in the life of human society becomes clear. When a child is born, then where is the best place for him in the first 2 years? The first 2 years, most of all, we like to spend in our mother's arms. Yes, and after that too. Well, mothers also love to hold their babies in their arms, moreover, even when it becomes inappropriate. There are cases when adult mothers try to put their adult children, who are twice as tall as their mothers, in their lap. But he is her child. He will always be her little child. Why? Because instinctive programs work. If a mother is able to not take her child in her arms, then from the point of view of biology, this is a defective biological individual that is not able to solve the task of reproduction of generations of the biological species. If the child prefers to live in mother's arms, what can this mother do then? Practically nothing, because as soon as the child is removed from her hands, the child cries. Moreover, his crying is not just at any frequencies, but only at those frequencies that the woman's organism perceives better than the male organism. Therefore, everything is done so that the child's crying can hook his mother, and so that the mother behaves correctly and does not let her child from her arms. But if the mother is occupied with her child, then it is clear that while the child is in her arms, there is little that she can do. And what she can do may not be enough to ensure the survival of herself and her child, and the reproduction of generations. Accordingly, who has to provide? A man, the dad. And what to do with this? After all, this also has to be done in an automatic mode. Therefore, there exists an instinctively programmed subordination of a man to a woman. Therefore, in all languages there are such sayings, nobody is a hero in front of his wife. A certain number of women abuse this instinctively conditioned biological dependence of men on women. At the level of biology and biochemistry, which is the easiest way to get out of these abuses? Actually, encephalography of the brain shows that under the influence of alcohol, the same areas of the brain are excited that are excited in a man during orgasm. Therefore, practice shows that working with alcoholic men individually is useless. If an alcoholic man can be pulled into remission, then his life partner immediately comes up with deep depression. Her depression ends when the man starts drinking again, and she again begins to nag him on the theme, "Again you are drunk," and so on. Psychologists and psychiatrists who know these dependencies work with the couple as a whole, because in order for a man to stop drinking, not only his psyche has to change, but the woman's psyche also has to change. There is one more question that is not clear to everyone, because the way of thinking that the school cultivates is to think in terms of situations, a change of situations. Every situation is viewed as motionless, not possessing internal dynamics. There are two literary characters, Oksana from Christmas Eve by N. Gogol, and Kabanicha from the drama The Thunderstorm by A. Ostrovsky. What is common? This is the same psychological type at different age periods. Kabanicha is already wise in life. She is a harsh, cruel widow who is able to turn her son into a total nothing. In order to be like that, it is enough to show off the way Oksana says mockingly, "Get me the Tsarina's slippers, blacksmith, and I will marry you." And Oksana has a future only if Vakula talks sense into himself and does almost the same with her as he does with the devil. That is, he neatly plans things and everything will fall into its place, after which Oksana will stop abusing her biologically female power over the man. These are giggles and gaggles, but nevertheless, this is a very serious task of life. If, during the Great Patriotic War, the women had told their men to stay home and not to go anywhere, then we would not be sitting here now. So this is not the easiest situation. If all this works in the automatic mode, on the basis of instincts with a zero level of cultural development, have the tasks of reproduction of the biological species been solved? No, they have not been solved, because the birth rate in the biological species of Homo sapiens is very low, and the mortality rate in the natural environment is quite high. How many of the total number of eggs laid by the herring reach adulthood? Less than 1%. The rest is eaten at the egg stage or the fry stage. How about crocodiles? 10 to 15% of crocodiles hatching from eggs reach adulthood and give birth to offspring. If such a birth rate and such a death rate were among humans, there would be no human species. In the conditions of civilization, that is, not with the lowest level of protection from nature, what were the mortality statistics in the Russian Empire? In this case, the question is about age groups. Half of the newborns died before the age of 10. Among those who crossed the 10-year mark, half died before the age of 40. Those who crossed the 40-year mark, factually, in the absence of medicine, in some cases passed the 100-year mark, and after that they lived more or less independently. When, throughout the empire, the centenary of the Battle of Borodino was celebrated, 5 people were found who maybe had not participated in the battle, but they had participated in the War of 1912. They were already over 100 years old, that is, at least 116 to 118 minimum, because they were taken as recruits without taking the age into account. So those guys walked by themselves, some of them did not hear very well, and someone died during the celebrations simply from an excess of impressions. With such a mortality rate, the maximum biological rate of birth that a woman can withstand is 1 child a year in the course of about 15 to 20 years. This is work until the state of wear, like a reproductive machine. But if there is only the natural environment, but there is no culture, and there is no social protection, then this is the only mode. What are fertility blockers? While a woman is breastfeeding, if a new conception occurs, then this is a biological malfunction. This should not happen. Due to the fact that a person has the longest childhood in relation to life expectancy, then the question on the statistics of survival of newborns arises. There is another characteristic connected with it. The characteristic in the difference between the genetic programs of the development of boys and girls. Because there are 2 lines at which the protection of the younger generations may be required. First, women. Children should not be exposed to danger. In order for this, a woman must have a supernatural sense, a premonition which today is called intuition, in order to sense danger tens of kilometers away and bypass by at least 7. Look at how we grow up. There comes a period when the girl suddenly becomes smart, reasonable, prudent, not in the sense that she can explain all the secrets of creation, but in the sense that she avoids danger. And if she sees a boy opening a PowerPoint, then the question is natural for a girl, what are you, a fool? And for the boy, it is unnatural not to open the PowerPoint if he's interested. And if you look at the life of the biological species as a whole, then the girl, having become smart, prudent, learns to use her intuition through this very supernatural sense of danger. And the second line of protection of children and women is connected with the fact that if for some reason they are under the impact of danger, someone must ensure their way out from under the impact of danger, moreover up to self-sacrifice. Because if we consider the issue of population reproduction, then 1 man and 20 women is not a biologically terrible fact, but if 1 woman and 20 men, this is already a nightmare. Around the same time that girls become smart and prudent, Boys begin to play with dangers. When boys play with danger, they develop the skill of meaningfully treating danger and the skill of self-mastery in the conditions of danger. If we lived in a fully fledged culture, and culture is also a factor of the environment that affects us while we grow up, then after girls have mastered intuition, they would move on to the next phase, mastering intellectual power and skills of self-mastery. And boys having mastered intellectual power and skills of self-mastery would move on to mastering this very intuition, supernatural premonition, and in this case, the life of civilization would be better, in the sense that there would be fewer conflicts between boys and girls when they grow up, because many conflicts stem from the fact that the genetic programs of the development of men and women in this culture do not fully open up to the end. How is this expressed in life? It is expressed in life in critical situations, sometimes ridiculously. 1956, North Atlantic, near the New York port, the Swedish liner Stockholm hits the Italian liner Andrea Doria. During the collision, about 40 to 50 people died, those who were in the destruction zone of the hulls of both ships. After that, Andrea Doria sank for 11 hours. The collision occurred at 23:17 local time, and the liner sank at 10:09 the next day. The vicinity of the port of New York is a busy shipping area, so there was someone to save them. The evacuation of everyone from Andrea Doria was completed by 5:30. Before leaving the ship, the emergency crews walked around it, checking if they had forgotten someone. They had. On the lower decks, which were filled with a mixture of water and ship's fuel oil, they found a group of women in negligee. The collision occurred when most of the passengers had already gone to bed, so everyone jumped out of their cabins in what they were wearing. Some were in nighties, and some, in general, in their natural form. Then a hysteria follows of the type, "Go away, nasty, I'm naked." This was no later than 7 a.m. and no earlier than 6 a.m. That is, at least 6 hours had passed since the collision, if not 7. And this is enough time to understand what is happening and develop an adequate response. However, the group was in a stupor, and when they were found, "Go away, nasty, I'm naked." The sailors of the emergency party grabbed everyone under their arms, carried everyone to the boat deck, put them in boats, covered them with blankets. Everything was fine. They saved everyone. But the most serious accusation that became known after the arrival of the rescued in New York was that most of the crew left the ship Andrea Doria before the passengers. That is, the Italian culture at that time did not ensure that boys were formed as men defenders. The mass exodus of the Italian crew instead of rescuing the passengers is an indicator of this. There is a video on the internet that characterizes another feature. The psyche of a man easily works in single-tasking mode, and many men cannot switch to multitasking mode, and for those who can, this is a certain strain. And the psyche of a woman easily works in multitasking mode, that is, talking on the phone, cooking soup, watching the child, and all this at the same time, for a woman is quite natural. Here we come to the question of what is behind the following anecdote. Mathematical logic is studied for 2 semesters, and woman's logic all life. Behind this anecdote, there is the man's view that does not understand the multitasking mode. If there is a multitasking mode, then there is only one speech apparatus, and the entire flow of information which is connected with all the tasks that are being simultaneously solved, the woman gives out to the external environment through one speech apparatus. When women communicate with themselves, they all have a multitasking mode. So what relates to one task and what relates to another is naturally perceived and no confusion arises. And for a man who cannot think in a multitasking mode, this whole stream of multitasking information is an inexplicable and incomprehensible woman's logic. But if everything is sorted out according to tasks, then everything falls into its place. There is a video on the internet named "Roma, you asshole," in which the situation is as follows. A car with a dash camera is moving on the road in winter. Apparently a woman is driving because a man's voice is commenting. The car, on the move with its left wheels, strikes the snow shaft which separates the lanes, and after that the car goes into a rhythmic skid, and then it gets stuck into a snowdrift. While the car is skidding around, the man's voice is heard, "Hold it, hold it." When they get stuck into the snowdrift, the woman's first phrase is, "Roma, how are you?" Roma, with some strong language, explains that he is fine. The woman's second phrase is, "You asshole." Outside of the point of view of the multitasking mode, this is not clear. On the one hand, she is worried about the state of this Roma. On the other hand, as soon as it turns out that he is fine, Roma is an asshole. Now let's look at the situation from the multitasking standpoint. The process ended, the car got stuck into the snowdrift. What needs to be done? Evaluate the situation. Make sure, check if help is required. Therefore the question, "Roma, how are you?" is quite relevant. Roma replies that he is fine. What does it mean? It means that this task has become irrelevant. Why is Roma an asshole? Because apparently beforehand he had insisted on her driving despite the fact that she did not want to. But he insisted because he wanted to teach his woman winter driving. The evaluation is appropriate because if he had followed her intuition, then nothing would have happened. And the fact that they got stuck in a snowdrift and the car did not wrap around a post, this was their luck. Another example on the same theme. Here is the plot in brief. King Priam reigns in Troy. He has children. Paris, daughter Cassandra, the Jretses of the Temple of Apollo, who can foresee the future. Once Cassandra comes to her dad and says that Paris will go to Greece, steal Helen. When he steals Helen, the Greeks will pay a return visit. How it all ended, you all know. The normal reaction of the king should have been as follows. He should have taken Cassandra's words into account and cancelled that trip. Time would have passed, the hormones would have stopped acting up in Paris, the situation would have been discharged, and everything could have been fine. These things are really closely connected with biology. If the culture was fully fledged, then girls would master intellectual power and skills of self-mastery, and boys would master supernatural premonition, and a lot would be easier in family relationships. What else is there connected with biology? Look, all cultures are full of anecdotes on the theme son-in-law and mother-in-law, and anecdotes on the theme daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. Who can recall? No one. Why? Because this is such a theme that does not even reach anecdotes. There are only tears. Because everything regarding the relationship of the son-in-law and the mother-in-law, well, it is more like the mother-in-law has another child. If you take the culture aside, biologically this is acceptable. If there is something wrong going on between the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, what is this? This is a conflict of instinctive programs, because from the point of view of the mother-in-law, her son is her very own child. And from the point of view of the wife of this son, the daughter-in-law of this mother-in-law, the son is her very own husband breadwinner. Her husband is that wall behind which only she should be and no one else. This conflict is insoluble, because if both women follow their instinctive programs, then the weak woman is expelled from the family. The only question is who is weak, the daughter-in-law? If the daughter-in-law, then the son lives on with his mother. If the mother-in-law, then in a civilized version, the families split in order to live in different places. After that, they just visit each other and everything is fine. This antagonism expresses the biological program of settling over the widest possible territory. That is, the expulsion of the daughter-in-law, together with the son, from the family, means their resettlement somewhere, and the mastery of new territories. In civilized society, this is not always appropriate, and the question arises, what to do? The answer to this question is simple. Unlike everything else in the biosphere, the structure of the human psyche is not programmed in an unambiguous way, and an adult specimen can be the carrier of one of four variants. Variant 1. Everything in his psyche is subordinate to instincts. Structurally, algorithmically, his psyche is no different from the psyche of an animal. Variant 2. The conflict between the demands of instincts and the norms of culture is resolved by one's own willpower in favor of culture. In Japan, the daughter-in-law knows that if she gives birth to a son, she herself will become a mother-in-law, and accordingly, she will obtain the entirety of the mother-in-law's rights and so on and so forth, and she works for this, obeying the will of the mother-in-law. In Rus, this was solved according to the circumstances. Nonetheless, divorce was never supported. Variant 3. It is when the creative potential of the willpower of an individual is realized according to the principle, I do what I want. Gogol's Oksana can serve as a good example. The themes not considered by Gogol are the questions of Oksana's relationship with Vakula's mother, who was, by the way, a witch. So, actually, a conflict between two demonic psyche types is also possible. But someone with the demonic psyche type, as a rule, turns out to be more functionally capable than carriers of the animal psyche type and those who are programmed by culture as zombies. Variant 4. With the demonic type of psyche structure, creativity and willpower do not know any nravious and ethical restrictions. The person of the demonic type of psyche structure is guided only by the apperceived by him purpose consonants, but a human is guided by sovest. That is, creativity and willpower must be subordinated to sovest. Functionally, in our psyche, sovest warns us against something or obliges us to do something, and shame, post facto, reproaches us for not having heeded the voice of sovest in due time. And all these conflicts on the theme the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law are successfully resolved when at least one of the women reaches the human type of psyche structure. In this case, the conflict is impossible because the instinctive programs do not work, and she is able, in relation to the other woman, to be either a senior comrade, a senior friend in the case of being her mother-in-law, or the daughter-in-law takes such a position that her mother-in-law becomes in relation to her another child, and she accepts this role. There are Soviet tales, Morozka, Father Frost, and Zolushka. In these tales, there is intraspecific competition. If the ecological niche is overfull, the birth rate in all biological species is greater than the capacity of the ecological niche. So, all excess ones are destroyed or expelled. If the ecological niche is overfull, then the stepmother strives to get rid of the adopted children, because they are not hers, and the ecological niche has to be occupied by her descendants, that is, purely instinctive programs of the biological species Homo sapiens also work. All this is the biological basis of culture. Next, we have to mention some obscene facts. One can't get away from biology, and sociology is a science from which one can learn a lot of unpleasant things about oneself. In a herd of baboons, the hierarchy is built according to the principle, who shows his penis to whom with impunity. Our rudeness, such as our and American corresponding gestures, are the cultural shells of the same. When you tell someone to F off in a certain direction, etc., this is all the same thing. This is a cultural shell of instinctive programs on the basis of which the hierarchy is built. Next, let's look at the culture of the Middle Ages. The ritual ceremony to confer knighthood. The monarch raises the sword just over the apprentice's head, flips it counterclockwise so that the same side of the blade will come into contact with the knight's body, and places it on his left shoulder. This ritual is the same thing, an instinctive program in a cultural shell. I place my sword on you, the same as I place my member on you, and you are therefore obliged to serve me. Yes, I accept that you place it down upon me, and I serve you. If you shake off all the cultural husks, then all that remains is this monkey's program. If we consider from the point of view of ethology, this is a branch of biology that studies the behavior of animals. All biological species are divided into strongly equipped and weakly equipped. If we understand teeth, claws, hooves, horns as equipment, it turns out that strongly equipped species are characterized by what biologists call high innate morality. This is expressed in the fact that in any conflicts of intraspecific competition, strikes that can kill or cripple the opponent are never delivered. It all boils down to demonstrating frightening poses, making frightening sounds. If this does not help, tigers usually just scratch each other's ears. Meanwhile, when hunting, the tiger jumps so as to hit the scruff of the neck with its open mouth and break the neck of the prey at once. When tigers sort things out with each other, they never behave like that. As for weakly equipped species, they have low morality, and everything is permissible among them. Herd monkeys are usually weakly equipped species. Man, like a monkey for the most part, is of a herd type with a very weak innate morality. If the level of culture and development of the civilization is close to zero, this is not a big deal. This weak, innate morality, with all its sneakiness and scoundrelism, like in a monkey herd, the leader gives one to another in the neck, and that one takes out all his resentment on the third, a weaker one. If there is a conflict, then it may be a group conflict. When a group of monkeys tyrannizes one monkey, a posture of submission may be a trick that is needed in order to extinguish the conflict now, so as to start it up again in more suitable conditions with different ratios. All this is also inherent in man. But man, besides this, also has innate sovest. In addition, he has willpower, which can also be in demand. And man, thanks to his sovest and his reasoning, seeing the manifestations of weak innate monkey morality, has to develop and become a human with a capital H. This leads to the question, what is the worst thing that parents can do with their children? The worst thing is unconditional obedience. Because if there is unconditional obedience, in this case, children can be like the daughters of Zolushka's stepmother, or like the son of Kabanicha in The Storm. Both are bad and problematic, both for themselves and for those around them. If we want the child to obey, then we extinguish his initiative. When we extinguish his initiative, then his willpower becomes unnecessary. We also extinguish his creativity and his sovest, because none of this is required. If in an audience you ask the following question, when was the last time you blushed with shame? Hardly anyone can remember because it was a long time ago, in childhood. If someone can remember relatively recent times, then he is just lucky. This means that shame and sovest are preserved somewhere. But by and large, all the problems of civilization come from sovestlessness, shamelessness, and willlessness. How is this manifested in life? Herd-pack instincts are also inherent in us. In nature, their purpose is collective activity, either of a defensive or of an aggressive character. In the Russian language, the herd are those that are hunted, and the pack are those that hunt. The only blocker of instincts in the psyche is meaningful willpower. That is, if the instinctive program is activated, then willpower can say stop, and the program will fade away. Parents achieve the obedience of the child. Shame and sovest are excluded from the algorithmics of the psyche. He has no will, or his will is subordinated to instincts and traditions. Adolescents enter the age of puberty, instincts wake up, activate, and what is next? The next thing is as follows. On a personal level, promiscuous sex, and no matter what the authors of the article in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia or other encyclopedias say about the fact that telegony does not exist, it does exist. And this is further biological degeneration of the offspring. Moreover, this applies to both men and women, because everything that is connected with promiscuous sex exerts an impact through the NOOSPHERE on the carriers of this promiscuous sex, and it impacts in such a way that these ancestral lines are cut off if the individual does not change his views, does not purify himself. The second question is adolescent collective crime. The kids have a get-together, brawn instead of brain. These kids have no will, no meaning, they just hang out. Their instincts of herd-pack behavior become more active, plus they need to show their toughness because the herd-pack cannot exist without hierarchy. Nobody wants anything like that, but as a result, they commit a serious crime. Statistics show that there is a sufficient number of children from so-called prosperous families in this type of crime. Why? Because at home they have abundance of everything in terms of consumerism, but their creative potentials are extinguished. Their parents have achieved obedience. The initiative of the children does not manifest itself. The children have no will, no meaning. There is something else that is inherent in animals. This is what ethologists call club behavior. When specimens gather in some place for no clear reason, just spend time together in some games. When it is club behavior, then functionally one task is solved. The task of attunement of the organism to the collective. This is necessary in order to carry out collective activity and follow the same herd-pack algorithmics. What's more, the herd-pack algorithmics, when it manifests itself in certain standard situations, where the main thing is the speed of reaction to the situation. Once the following experiment was carried out. There are fish that can live alone, and there are fish that can only live in schools. The herring is a schooling fish. So they take a herring from an aquarium school, they almost completely remove its brains, and only that minimum remains that helps the fish to swim and perform its psychological functions. That is, it has no brains. Although it initially has fish brains, anyway they still evaluate the situation. And now this brainless herring becomes the leader of the school, because it does not waste time processing incoming information. It has no brains. The reaction is instantaneous and reflexive. And since this herring is the first to react, it is the first to set a pattern of behavior that all the others copy. And this is common in the herd-pack algorithmics in all biological species, including humans. Therefore, in all herd-pack manifestations, the leaders are not the smartest, the most knowledgeable, but the fastest. And usually, if there is no manipulation towards the crowd, the fastest is the most stupid, because he turns off his brain, which is factually defective. So the reaction to the situation is fastest and most reflexive. But if you need to evaluate the situation, you are late in relation to him. Therefore, Pushkin wrote, "Stay away from the crowd." That is, being in a crowd, you need to preserve, save your individuality, and this solves many things. This is all that concerns the biological basis of civilization. And culture is formed on this. Culture is variable. There can be no determined typology of cultures and subcultures in their composition, which, along with biology, determine the quality of life of society. In principle, all this should be written in a school textbook, moreover, long before grade 8, because all this needs to be known before children enter adolescence and before their instincts wake up. How can parents be patient with this younger generation? And how not to manifest that which the parents themselves have not worked out and not yet got rid of? Parents need to manifest meaningful willpower and block what is still present in them. One has, first of all, to put things in order in one's own psyche.